Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be calling in from. I'm so excited to welcome you all into this space for this short but absolutely powerful hour I know we're going to have. We're here to learn, we're here to share and grow together, and it's really good to be with you all. So by way of introductions, my name is Mara Dolan. I use she, her, and I'm here representing the Women's Environment and Development Organization. And we do as part of a broad and really powerful collective of organizations that make up the Feminist Coalition for a Green New Deal, as are the feminists who are sharing this space with me. And we all know that there can be no gender justice without climate justice. So this coalition came together in early 2019 out of recognition that feminism demands collective action. The coalition consists of individuals and organizations working towards justice at all of the intersections that the climate crisis touches, and it touches them all. Migrant justice, racial justice, economic justice, labor justice, reproductive justice, gender justice, and more. And we came together knowing that any feminist approach to climate policy must seek to combat and repair historical oppressions. It must advance a transformative feminist agenda that centers the leadership of women. It must address the generational impacts of colonization and anti-Black racism. And it must be led by and articulated by frontline impacted communities, especially women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, queer folks, people from the Global South, migrant and refugee communities, and youth. This moment of economic crisis and pandemic that we face right now, of entrenched inequality and violence against those already pushed to the margins, grows from these same roots of white supremacy, extractivism, patriarchy, and colonialism that a feminist analysis always sees as interconnected. These systems of violence depend on each other, and they all must be dismantled. So the Feminist Coalition knows this moment is demanding a justice-centered, people-centered recovery that radically transforms how we treat each other and how we treat the world. The care economy of nurses and domestic workers, elder care, childcare, and more is and always has been essential. Regeneration and not exploitation is our only path forward. Frontline activists do and always have had the solutions. This moment is exposing the real roots of this crisis and the truth of what kind of radical, collective, care-centered, resilient response is needed of us. So I'm just really honored to be here with these truly extraordinary women, feminists, leaders, activists, and thinkers, and to be in conversation and community with you all. So we're going to embark on this conversation teach-in style, creating space for each of these women to share some of their knowledge and perspectives of where we are right now and where we need to go, and then move into calls to action before concluding with a little bit of Q&A. So please share your questions with us in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring them in order to bring back to the panelists at the end of the call. And on the note of the chat box, I will also be serving as accessibility coordinator for the call. So please feel free to reach out using the private chat box. My name is Mara. If you're having tech difficulties or if you have a request for how to make the call more accessible to you, like asking speakers to slow down or speak more directly into the camera, my private chat box is open. So before I turn to the panelists and begin our conversation, I'd actually like to pause and ground us with the work of a really incredible musician and dear friend, Beilu Sarkisian, who is going to share a song with us before we dive in. And I'd like to take a lesson here from legendary Black activist and feminist Toni Cade Bambara, who taught us that, quote, the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible, unquote. So as feminists, of course, we know that the role of art in our healing and in our movement work cannot be understated. And it's so critical to our resilience in this moment right now and always. And that's why I'm so excited to welcome Beilu in to introduce herself and to share a song with us. Beilu, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this amazing event alongside some amazing women. This song that I'm going to sing is based off of a poem that I wrote. It's called Meditation on Nature / the Body. And it was just a poem that I wrote when I was walking one day. And I was going to pick a flower, but I stopped myself because I kind of just started to question the entitlements that I had kind of like been programmed with, that like for some reason I have the privilege to just like rip this flower like off this branch. And not saying that like that's something that people don't do, and that's something that I don't still do sometimes, but it was just kind of like a questioning of these like beliefs that I have, that I and am entitled to this life. And I kind of just connected that with, the world's view on generally the physical environment, the non-human environment, how we feel entitled to it, entitled to exploit it. We also feel that way towards women and women's bodies. So yeah, this is kind of a reflection on that reflection. And a song was created out of that.
Seduced by its your perfume, temptation employs me to disrupt sanctuary, disrupt sanctuary, disrupt sanctuary. Breaking gentle branches from their vitality. Breaking gentle branches from their vitality. And Lord, unlike any other, conspires to tear a dew from its mother. A potent concoction trickles through moist air. Melting into vascular devices, removing tightness, unhinging constrictions, positively paradise, state of mind, state of mind, brought on by your design. Considerately I concede to pick a fallen leaf, rather than extract glowing seed, letting it live its own dream outside of the one I was taught I could deem, outside outside of the one, outside of the one I was taught I could do. Outside of the one I was taught I could do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beilu. I encourage everyone, wherever they are calling in from, to clap or snap, whatever celebrations make sense for you for Beilu. Beilu, thank you so much for that song. I so appreciate the gift you've given us with that and letting us carry it forward into our conversation. Is there a place that folks can turn to find more of your work?
Yeah, if anyone wants to follow me on Instagram at Beilu Elisa, BELUOLISA, that's where I post things, and I'll be releasing a song very soon. So if you follow me, then you can find the song pretty easily.
Amazing. Thank you, Beilu. You can also put the handle in the chat if folks can copy and paste it. So thank you again, Beilu. Big snaps. I so appreciate you grounding us in that. So let's dive in and turn to Catherine. Catherine, one thing that I have always looked to you and We Can for leadership on is how your analysis of how we got here and where we need to go. It always feels so grounded in cutting through the chaos of the noise and having a very clear-eyed understanding of root causes and of the forces that we're up against and what we need to safeguard our present and future. So I would love to ask you to introduce yourself and then help us understand what are the connections between the crises that we're facing right now.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Mara. Thanks for unmuting me. Beilu, thank you so much for this song. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good morning. As Mara said, my name is Catherine. I'm Numu Lixiu Nimipu, a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, which is located in Central Oregon, and I'm calling in from
Is Catherine paused for other folks?
of capitalism, colonization, patriarchy, and white supremacy, which have led to centuries of resource extraction from stolen indigenous lands, labor exploitation of Black POC, working poor, low-income communities, and the commodification of nature to turn a profit, kind of buttressed by settler colonialism, including imperialism and militarism. And all of these systems have really been set up to only serve the 1%, right? And to continue prioritizing their profit over our lives, over our livelihoods as Indigenous peoples and communities of color and low-income and working poor communities. And these systemic oppressions show up throughout our communities, within our movements and within the policy-making spaces where people are deciding, right, how we respond to these pandemics, how we respond to climate change, and that shows up in the criminalization of our bodies, in racist gerrymandering, voter suppression, which is a big, we're already seeing that right now where Wisconsin made people go vote in person while we're in a public health pandemic, access to medical supplies, to reliable, safe, affordable housing, and to all these different spaces. I think, you named a lot of them, Mara, and we've seen how these systems have really impacted essentially every part of our daily life, and that in this health pandemic, we're seeing again that these systems are disproportionately harming Indigenous peoples, Black communities, communities of color, low-income, working poor communities. I saw that in Louisiana, they released data that showed that African Americans account for 70% of all deaths in the state related to COVID, and that again in New Mexico, 31% of the people who have contracted COVID right now are Indigenous, are Native Americans. And I don't know if anyone's been watching the coverage of Navajo Nation and how they've been dealing with COVID in their communities. We just got 2 COVID cases in our community here. And it's scary, right? We don't have resources. The closest, if someone needs a ventilator, that's an hour away from our Indigenous, or an hour and 15 minutes away really from our Indigenous community. So there's these disparities that already exist that are gonna end up killing people within this pandemic, and that all of these disparities are further amplified by the very intentional actions of our governments and our corporations to choose profit over people every single chance they get. Every single chance they get, they choose profit over our communities, over the lives of Indigenous peoples living on the front lines of resource extraction and toxic pollution, and who are already vulnerable because of these health disparities, because of these lack of resources to COVID-19. And so this is a big issue. And in addition to this, we also know that those in power have been treating the earth in a similar way, with blatant disrespect for the spirit of all living beings, leading to, deforestation of old growth forests that sequester vast amounts of carbon in Alaska, or loss of habitat because of fracking, and that this loss of habitat has actually, scientists have started looking at how that's connected to COVID and how that could actually lead to further pandemics in the future. So I do think right now there's time to, and a necessity to really reevaluate at a policy level and an institutional level, and even at a personal level, right, our relationship with nature. And I think, Bailey, you opening that song with us about, how are we entitled to pick that flower? What is our reciprocal relationship we have with nature, and how are we being with the earth in a good way and defending those rights of nature and all living beings, as well as our communities. And so I think in this time of colliding crisis and failing infrastructure, I'm hopeful that this moment can offer space to unearth these root causes of the global health pandemic and the global climate crisis, and draw those connections that are needed across movements, across issue areas, across political boundaries. I live in a conservative area, and I know that despite our politics, we're all feeling this we're all feeling this in right now. And so how can we start dismantling these detrimental extractive systems of oppression, start building community and having those hard conversations, and investing in the future that we seek and that we need right now to combat not only this global health pandemic, but the climate crisis, which already is impacting frontline communities, and base that on these feminist principles and rights of nature, and centering Indigenous, Black, POC frontline leadership, and leading with a dedication to being in community with one another, and in reciprocity with the earth. And I'm super honored to be on this panel with everyone. I know we're gonna dive into that, less at this broad level, but we're going to dive into those solutions and examples and policy and those tenets right now. So I'll just leave it here, and thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Catherine. I so appreciated all of those points. And I think this piece that you're bringing in of how, as you said, being in community with each other and being in community with the earth needs to be the orientation in which we're moving. For me, it reminds me how much of our economy is truly centered on and dependent on care, right? Care for our communities and care for each other and care for the earth, but how utterly devalued this work is. And Marisol, I know so much of your work is really about bringing in what a feminist economy can look like, what it does look like, and what it must look like. So I would love to invite you to introduce yourself and your work, and I'd love if you could help us understand in this moment, what does it look like to bring an intersectional feminist analysis to the crises we're facing right now?
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you, everybody. And buenos dias from New Mexico. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to share our story and for listening to our story. Actually, before I begin, I would like to take a moment of silence to remember the women of the Rana Plaza collapse. 7 years ago today, the Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing more than 1,100 people, mostly women. It was the deadliest disaster in the clothing industry. And these women worked in unsafe conditions for unfair wages, and they died because of capitalism and patriarchy. So let's take a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. So I work for the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We work for racial and gender justice and social and economic equality. And we know that women's work in the global South, like the work of the women in Rana Plaza, that capitalism and patriarchy must make that work invisible in order to continue. So at SWAP, we created an exercise to describe this. Thanks to Maria Poblet's image of an iceberg that represents capitalism. So close your eyes for a second and imagine an iceberg. And on the top, the part of the ice that you see, that represents the paid labor of capitalism. And then underneath, that giant part of the iceberg that is invisible under the ocean, that is the labor that capitalism has to make invisible in order to stay afloat. Okay, you can open your eyes now. So to make it tangible, we got a plastic bin and we covered it with paper that looks like water all around it. And then on the top, we cut a hole on one side that your hand can fit through. And on the other side, we made a paper mache iceberg covered in Velcro. And then we go around the room and each person puts their hand into the water and pulls out a toy that represents unpaid invisible labor. So maybe it's a crib or a grocery bag or a calendar. And then we ask the people to thank the person in their life who does that unpaid labor for them. And this is a way that we make invisible labor visible. And oftentimes it's really crazy, especially when I do it with a bunch of mamas, a bunch of women, because they find themselves thanking themselves over and over again. And it feels weird when you realize that, you know, we're socialized often not even to see all the work that we ourselves do for our families and our communities because of capitalism and patriarchy. So in New Mexico at SWAP, we have been listening and dreaming with our members, with our healers and our elders and our mamas. And we've been dreaming together what a feminist economy would look like in New Mexico. And right now, we're trying to put our visions into practice. So we responded to this pandemic by listening to what our members wanted and what they needed. And they told us they needed money. They can't access federal stimulus dollars because of their documentation status, because of their age, their involvement with the system. They told us they needed protective gear. They're being cut out of access due to the consequences of capitalism and racism and patriarchy. And so we at SWAP decided to use our privilege and our 40-year history to try our best to move money from the money holders. We listened and we heard, and what we heard is that our communities are ready to support our communities. And they asked SWAP to resource the effort to provide connection and coordination. So we are applying for money like mad, and we are doing grassroots fundraising. And much more importantly, we're building deep intersectional relationships that are mutual and symbiotic. And this is the work that fortifies the trencitas, or the braids, that we're weaving together for each other. And it fortifies them with trust. We also believe in radical transparency. And so I wanted to share with you some of the quick numbers about this work that we're doing. So far we've raised $3,151 from the grassroots. We've raised $12,000 from Foundation Rapid Response money, and we've committed $5,000 of SWAP's general operating money to this effort. The members we are paying to make masks have been cut out of the social safety net due to their status as refugees, being undocumented, underage, or systems involved. We are distributing masks through 5 previously established SWAP relationships, and they include 2 of our fiscally sponsored groups, the Trans Woman Empowerment Initiative and the Pueblo Action Alliance, who are doing incredible frontline work to get protective gear to houseless trans folks and to people out on the reservations. We're working with the Bernalillo County Reintegration Center, who we already have a previous relationship with. And we're working with SWAP members who are connected with migrants who are detained in ICE facilities right now in New Mexico. And we're also working with a domestic violence shelter that is close to the SWAP offices. So we are building on long-term relationships that started long before this pandemic, and they will sustain long after. Everyone involved in this project is getting paid a fair wage. We are crowdsourcing materials from our membership and providing materials and sewing machines to anyone that we can involved in the project. And we're listening to our members who are doing the work, because they are the experts on how to improve our systems and our distribution, and they are the ones who know what's needed. I'm the CFO of SWAP, so I'm using all the energy that I have to get the money from those who have it, and then to move it to my amazing soul-feeding community. So for SWAP and for myself, intersectional feminist analysis in this moment means listening. It means opening our eyes to the ones who are doing the invisible, undervalued labor, and doing all we can to honor and resource them beyond COVID-19. Or as Chicana literary critic Te Diana Rebolledo describes, we're trying to elevate women's work from the mundane to the sublime. So thank you all for, I had to write it all out so I could get it good, but thank you for listening to my story and our story in New Mexico. Much love for you all.
Yes, thank you, Marisol. I love that last quote. Thank you for bringing that into our conversation, the sublime. I love that. So your points, Marisol, really brought me back again to the need for intersectional feminist leadership to really be the ones influencing and directing the policy conversations around what a just recovery right now and what a feminist Green New Deal could look like. And those leaders, demonstrated by you all on this call and so many others, need not only to be at the table, but of course directing the policy conversation itself, right? So Atiana, I'd like to turn to you. The whole Feminist Green New Deal Coalition has really raised its voice in support of the people's bailout efforts. These really comprehensive demands being placed on the halls of power in Washington, D.C. right now by activists who know that we need a people-centered policy response for a just recovery. Can you help us understand, after you introduce yourself, what would a policy response to the pandemic that is actually rooted in an ethic of care for people on the planet look like?
Cool. Thanks, Maura. And such a privilege to be in conversation with all of you and to lift up the narrative of the feminist Green New Deal. My name is Atiana Scazzaro. I use she, her pronouns, based in Washington, D.C. And I work at the Sierra Club, which is a large grassroots environmental organization based here in the U.S. And I work on our gender equity program. And I see my colleagues Jessica Olson and Sonia Linder on this conversation as well. And the three of us work in partnership with grassroots leaders to lift up the stories and disproportionate impact of climate change and toxic exposure on women and marginalized communities, and try and translate that into policy action. So the Earth Week, we're here, an unforeseen period in our lives and in history. And one thing that I've been thinking about is how all of our stories and experiences coming out of this crisis are going to look different based on our economic circumstances, our health, our families, our geography. And that we know that women of color, and people of marginalized identities are going to be facing longer term impacts than others. I've been hearing stories about how N95 masks aren't designed to fit women's faces, despite the fact that 90% of nurses are women. We know that Black women are underemployed, frontline workers, and at risk of a number of different threats because we were already vulnerable before this crisis. And this holds true for climate as well. It's not easy to bounce back from air pollution when you live by a coal-fired power plant, or to move to safety after a storm if you didn't already have a safety net to begin with. And one thing in thinking about this conversation that we produced just last month, which is crazy, is a report, feels like ages ago, in partnership with Sierra Club and We Do, and with great guidance from Francis, who I look forward to hearing from next, examining what these impacts of climate change look like in the United States. And we know that it's not just women. Men are dying at higher rates and experiencing climate impacts differently too, based on where they work or how they respond to disasters. But we also know that women are leaders, and Sierra Club, in partnership with the Women's Earth Alliance, has been working to support grassroots women's leaders through a partnership on an accelerator program, which is actually launching next week, a call for applications. So folks on this call are interested, I can share more. But because we know that the leaders in communities are already doing so much with so little, and any support, like Marisol mentioned, financial or elevating their profiles or supporting with other resources that the Sierra Club and our networks have at our disposal, can be powerful and help strengthen the movement and the work that they're doing. In particular, some of the folks who have gone through the accelerator program I've been inspired by are leading food security and recovery efforts and really pivoting in this moment from their climate or kind of planned programming to urgent needs in their communities. And it's just a testament to the long-standing relationships that hold power in being able to position ourselves to help at a moment's notice. Working with local governments on watershed policy, or educating communities about pesticides and farm worker exposure. So what does this look like for policy? I think we're really at a moment where policy action can translate into some really long-term impacts if we do it right. There's, of course, immediate action that needs to happen to save lives. But like Mara mentioned, the People's Bailout really frames the conversation around longer term systemic solutions that we've known about, but haven't really had the political space to have that conversation. And so it's peoplesbailout.org, I believe I can, yeah, peoplesbailout.org. And there's 5 principles to ground care for people and the planet in our response to this moment, to ensure long-term relief and recovery that addresses wealth inequality, racism, and environmental concerns. So the 5 principles are health as a top priority, and one thing that remains unanswered is a need for paid leave for everyone. And so hoping that the next policy, the round of policy work, can really address that. Providing economic relief directly to people. There was a risk that guardrails on securing funding for women and minority-owned businesses would be removed. And this can often happen in times of crisis where policies will be removed in the spirit of simplicity, but in fact are meant to further harm or marginalize communities that don't otherwise have an opportunity to access funds. And so we've successfully defended those existing policies. There's a need to ensure that people's water and electricity stays on in this public health crisis. And so working to make sure that that remains true across all states. The third is rescuing workers and communities, not corporate executives. And like others mentioned, the 3-day Earth Day Live, the past happening currently, has been really inspiring and reminding us that fossil fuel bailouts are unacceptable and that we really need to make sure that our economic recovery reaches the people that need it most. The fourth is to make a down payment on a regenerative economy while preventing future crises. And I think this is where the crux of that environmental transformation can happen. If we invest in clean energy and infrastructure, buildings, manufacturing, land and agriculture, then we really have an opportunity to transform not just coming out of this moment, but the next decades and what our whole economy can look like. And the last of the People's Bailout Principles is to protect our democratic process while protecting each other. And the Wisconsin elections were already mentioned, but we're just months away from another election, and vote by mail, voter registration, the census, all of these things need to be incorporated into financial investments to make sure that they run smoothly and are equitable. So I also had a quote that I wanted to end with. One that has been sitting with me is by author Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote, "There are years that ask questions and there are years that answer." And I think we've all been trying to sit with some really big questions and hoping that we're, as feminists, as climate activists, asking the right questions right now and calling for our policy solutions to be sure to answer them. So thank you for this conversation and look forward to being part of what that action can look like.
Thank you, Atiana. I love how many of us are ending with quotes. It's very feminist of us to bring in as many voices as possible. So thank you, Atiana. And you know, everything that you named around crafting an architecture of policies that really are quite common sense, that are straightforward in understanding human rights as central to our decision making, made me think about how critical it is to really have a strong gender analysis and information, like you touched on in that report, as part of that conversation. How we have to have really strong tools for gender analysis to lift up the demands and meet the needs that science and justice demand of this moment. So Frances, you're someone who I have admired for so long in the ways that within academia and as an environmental educator and teacher, you really center a radical and feminist analysis. So after you introduce yourself, Frances, I would love to ask you to help us understand why a gender analysis is key to climate action and policy for a just recovery.
All right. Yes, of course. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here listening to everyone else's really important, timely, brilliant points. I've been taking notes. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Frances Roberts Gregory. I am a feminist climate researcher, doctoral student at UC Berkeley, and I'm currently living, working, and social distancing or physically distancing in Bobancha, also known as New Orleans. This is the land of many tongues, and it's also home to many indigenous peoples, as well as frontline communities of color, including many African diasporic people, Vietnamese folk, and also folk from Honduras. And my research focuses on how Gulf Coast Black and Indigenous women resist environmental racism, navigate relationships with energy and petrochemical industries, and also how they imagine how we can survive in these post-apocalyptic futures. Like, what are their solutions for energy, environmental, climate, food housing, transportation, education, justice. And so my work really tries to center women of color, youth, and indigenous leadership in the climate crisis. And sorry, this is my cat. He wants to say hi. And I think it's really important to center their stories because they are the frontline leaders taking on energy and petrochemical industries. And they're also working with youth to ensure that the next generation is prepared. So for example, last year, I helped manage the Gulf Equity Water Corps project with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, which is really focused on building the leadership capacity of youth in Texas and Louisiana around sea level rise, stormwater management, and local flooding. Also, I've been inspired by indigenous women who are fighting pipelines, such as the Bayou Bridge pipeline, folk who are involved in green infrastructure projects, community gardens, and even advocating for community portfolio standards. And like I mentioned, these are the stories I really want to highlight as a climate communicator. And I think the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal is so important because it shows that our voices should be at the table and not on the menu when important decisions are made around recovery and response and a just response. So I have a few key points that I wanted to go over today. I think gender analysis is so important to climate action because our actions to promote environmental, energy, and climate justice will actually perpetuate ongoing inequality if we don't understand how different communities, bodies, and geographies are differentially impacted by climate disaster. We also see women on the front lines leading these grassroots struggles, as some of you mentioned already. Yet, oftentimes, white men are still the face of the climate movement in the mainstream media. And this is a problem because representation matters when we talk about who's going to lead the climate movement and who sees themselves as an environmentalist. Even when we talk about organizing strategies, feminists, indigenous folk, LGBTQ communities often employ tactics that are less based on hierarchy and more focused on care and consensus. And when we talk about everyday gender strategies of refusal and resistance in communities of color, we can talk about the mundane, such as having a conversation with a loved one who works in oil and gas, and the spectacular, such as organizing the March Against Death Alley. We can also talk about how women are underrepresented in international climate negotiations, which is a particular problem because we can see that these negotiations are not leading to the solutions that we need. We can also talk about who has the hardest time recovering or returning after a disaster, and that's gendered and racialized. And also when we talk about masculinity, we can focus on how like this toxic masculinity or hegemonic forms of masculinity as exemplified by some of our current leaders actually contribute to widespread environmental destruction. And this false idea that we are not interconnected, that our survival does not depend on the survival of other species and other people. But we also don't want to paint all men-identified folk with a broad stroke because actually there's many men who are first responders and who are impacted emotionally by ongoing crisis, yet their needs aren't always addressed because it's not always culturally accepted to present that type of vulnerability. And we can also talk about how men of color are particularly vulnerable to premature death, disease, and disability, as evidenced by ongoing climate crisis, as well as COVID-19. I think that a gender analysis is key to policy for a just recovery because we need policies that center frontline communities. We need a just transition for workers in the Gulf South to jobs and renewables, also jobs that allow them to feed their families. We don't need to demonize folk who are doing the best they can with limited options. And we also need to ensure that we don't support policies that criminalize female water protectors, that when we designate pipelines, for example, as critical infrastructure. If Indigenous women, for example, are taking the lead fighting pipelines, then they're disproportionately impacted by these criminalization bills. Finally, I would just say that a feminist or gendered analysis makes sure that our disaster and environmental recovery policies don't designate us as victims that need saving, but as capable change agents with important solutions so that we can all live in communities that promote health, safety, and self-actualization. And this means that no one is left behind and you know, as many other feminists have said in the past, this is an opportunity. Crisis is also an opportunity. And so we mustn't forget that fact. And we have to ensure that everyone is provided for in a feminist economies that center childcare, education, housing, transportation, and also special provisions for folk who are disproportionately impacted. So I guess I will stop with my comments there, and my cat is going crazy right now. And thank you so much for this opportunity to share some of my evolving thoughts with you all.
Thank you, Frances. Big snaps. I so appreciated being able to hear your points about seeing frontline feminists as agents of change while also double tasking and petting your cat. I wish I had introduced them as the seventh speaker. Okay, this has been incredible to hear all of you speak to the areas that you are leading in and share all of your wisdom and these powerful words with us. I would love to move next into just a quick lightning round of calls to action that all of the 80 plus folks who are on this call right now, and the many who will watch this afterwards when they're able, can do after taking part in this conversation. So I'm going to start, I'll just go through the order that we just spoken. So I'm going to start with you, Catherine. What is one ask or call to action that you'd like to make to folks tuning in right now?
I know you said one. One is so hard.
Come on.
First, follow We Can International Women's Earth Climate Action Network. I'm going to put our website in there. I would encourage everyone to vote and to just go vote. Just participate in this democracy. We can talk about the concept of democracy, but yes, just vote for feminist policies and all those great folks at the state level and your council, and your local town council, a chamber of commerce, whatever, at the federal level. Please vote. And then a lot of people often, I'm the climate friend in my friend group back home. And so a lot of people ask me, what can I do about this? And often what I tell them is, whatever you're passionate about, just like do that fully and commit your skills to that. So some of my friends are like into prison abolition or into socialism, like that's what their passion is and that's what their driving force is. And so I just encourage people to figure that out for yourself. Mine is climate justice, is Indigenous rights, and I want to put the skills that I have gained throughout my life towards that. So if that's something that you have the capacity for right now, I would just encourage you to figure out what that is for you and just to commit to that fully and wholeheartedly, because we need people who are passionate and who are dedicated, and we need a bajillion different types of skills, and we need artists and communicators and people who make really cool Excel sheets. So I think, that would be where I will leave that for my 1 minute. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. And I appreciate all the folks putting the links and the places that folks can find more resources in the chat as Catherine spoke. Before I move to Marisol for your action steps, I'd also love to just jump in here and say, if folks have questions, we're going to moderate the Q&A for the last 8 minutes or so via the chat. So please feel free to stick any questions you have that can be directed to all of the speakers or one in particular before we wrap up. So Marisol, I'd love to invite you. What is your action step you'd like folks tuning in to take?
Well, I would say we are definitely going to be participating in a May Day action, May Day 2020 general strike. So, we're doing it virtually so folks can participate in that in solidarity with all workers around the world. And then, yes, please consider, check out the GoFundMe, consider making a donation. Please consider sharing it to all of the people in your life who care also about helping the people who are getting cut out of everything and struggling to survive, but also doing all of the invisible work to keep us thriving. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marisol. All right, Atiana.
Thanks, Mara. The two kind of national things to make sure are on folks' radar are the People's Bailout and participating and following that, as well as the Feminist agenda for a Green New Deal. You can sign up for updates and to get further involved. But the thing that I've been moved by is I was an advisory neighborhood commissioner, a local neighborhood elected official for a couple of years, and there were organizations that I learned about in that role that were literally in my neighborhood, on my block, that were doing incredible work that I've grown to be more involved in, and encourage folks to find out what those local organizations are. We can often feel paralyzed by not knowing which place to donate or how to get involved, but like literally just like you said, Catherine, picking one that you care about or picking a couple and just, you know, getting involved can really be powerful, both for the organization and for yourself. So thanks.
Thanks, Atiana. All right, and Francis?
Hi, yeah. So I just would echo what everyone else has said. I think those are really great steps. And also, I feel like it's really important. I always go back to education as an educator to just educate yourself. There's so many resources out there. And I oftentimes need a refresher. So like take some time to look up a new environmentalist, a feminist that you've never heard of, and learn more about their story, what they're working on. If you're able to donate to different grassroots causes, the work continues, even if we're, some of us are, you know, physically distancing ourselves, the work still goes on. So maybe join some of those local organizations. I know groups like the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, even like Another Gulf is Possible, they've been having webinars. So like just get involved and surround yourself with like-minded folk, because oftentimes it can feel very overwhelming, but when you're in community with like-minded people, it seems doable. So like I would say practice self and community care, and, you know, make some new friends virtually.
Absolutely. Thanks, Francis. All right. Thank you all for those action steps. That means everyone has something to do right after they leave this call in a few moments. I'm seeing some questions roll in from the chat that I'd love to maybe just list off, and then I'll throw them to you all as the panelists, and you can decide if you'd like to speak to one or all of them. So I am reading, how were the feminist principles for the Green New Deal created? Which again are on the website. You can read them. How does grassroots feminist internationalism shape your work? What can we do to stand up for frontline women workers right now? And what is a moment of feminist solidarity that you have celebrated this week, this Earth Week? So feel free to take a stab at any of those, all of those. I'll throw it out to you all.
I'm glad to jump in. Yes, and the principles were created over the course of many months with a lot of different stakeholders putting their minds together to develop what would be the grounding for this work. It was dozens of organizations and leaders, both kind of conceptually brainstorming and then a lot of copy editing and thoughtful care around what those words can really represent. So yeah, I'm excited to see what the next chapter for those principles will look like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Oh no, you go, Francis.
I was gonna say, I was gonna maybe try to tackle the question about feminist solidarity. For me, it's been like the simple acts of kindness. So I've been dealing with a lot of death and loss in my family as well as COVID-19. And I've had people reaching out, but also folk reaching out and saying, bringing me plants to grow so I can grow vegetables, and offering, you know, other types of support. So I think that's been really meaningful as like a lot of us process like joy and excitement as well as like grief and confusion, just having folks showing up and dropping off supplies, medicines, things of that nature.
Thanks, Frances. I love that. I think similarly. I wasn't going to answer that question, but I think I live with my family, which includes my sister and my mother, and I don't know. It's just nice. I think like what you said of our aunt created our masks for us. We shared the foods that we had saved from past gathering seasons and sent those to her. So I do feel like these like systems of reciprocity and care for the people we love is very encouraging to me right now, and just that opportunity to touch base and connect with people I don't always, even though I care deeply for them, but they just don't live near me and I don't get to see them all the time. And then I think I just wanted to bring in a call to action from one of WeCan's webinars this past week that was part of Earth Day Live. We had Dr. Rupa Maria, who is a professor and doctor in San Francisco, and working, in those hospitals right now as a frontline worker there. And she again echoed, I think Mary Sol said this, the call for a general strike on May Day. So I just want to like encourage that. And she, was really asking like, we need people to help bring this issue and bring this up for us as well as we're working hours and hours to support people in the hospitals. So just wanted to do another shout out for May Day general strike, which is also my birthday. Strike for my birthday.
Happy early birthday, Catherine. Marisol, did you want to hop in here?
I can share a moment of feminist solidarity with you all from this week. So our New Mexico Con Mujeres group out of SWAP, we work with healers statewide. And one of the healers we work with, Veronica Iglesias, she creates these cards called the Jade Oracle cards. They're based in ancient deities from Mexico. And they're like a powerful tool in general, but we wanted to, in an effort to, again, with the feminist economy visions in mind, we kind of, because we're all socially distanced and we're trying to stay connected, we bought a bunch directly from her to then distribute to our Con Mujeres members and have her, she's going to be able to do a little Zoom class with us and connect us all together in this way where we can't physically, being physically connected with each other is really important to our work, actually. And so this is one way that we can still maintain our connection, still support our people that are doing all the really important healing work that is more important than ever right now, and to really honor our roots.
Thank you, Marisol. All right, so that brings us to the end of this call. I just want to also center or ground all of the incredible calls to action and principles that folks have asked us to lead our work with, and know that we know as feminists that if we work together according to feminist values and feminist principles, and we've touched on so many of the ones that the coalition lives by on this call, from creating regenerative economies that center systemic feminist alternatives, to rejecting the false and harmful responses to climate change that don't address root causes, to advancing reproductive justice, confronting exploitative and unsustainable production patterns. If we live by these values and our policies are guided by these principles, we have the capacity to create the change demanded of us now by generations to come. So I invite you all to head on over to the Feminist Green New Deal website if you haven't already, to read fully through the principles. You can also sign up there for email updates and action alerts. Maybe this is my call to action. We're going to be hosting a town hall for folks invested and interested in this coalition's work in May. So you'll get an email about that once you sign up, and you can save the date. I'd also encourage all of you to attend the next online dialogue between FemGND Coalition members, which is next Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m. via the Women's March webinar site. And you'll be hearing 6 other feminist voices speak to this moment and its needs. And I would just say here, one of the real strengths of the coalition is the really rich diversity of organizational and individual perspectives that are brought together. So I can really say that you'll be learning new and important things by hearing another set of members speak. And it's a really incredible lineup of Tara Hauska, founder of GNU Collective, Cindy Weissner of GGJ, Jackie Patterson of the NAACP Environment and Climate Justice Program, Diana Duarte of Madre, Bridget Burns of We Do, and Osprey Oriel Lake of We Can. So you'll be able to register for that on the FemGND website soon, and of course we'll receive email updates about that. And before we close out and we give one last huge magnanimous thank you to these panelists and to Belu for welcoming us with song, I would love to just end, as the organizers that we are, with a chant. I know many of you are familiar with this one. So I invite all of the panelists to unmute themselves and repeat after me. And everyone who's listening in, please do the same. It will make us feel really powerful. Okay, so just repeat after me. We are unstoppable. Another world is possible. We are unstoppable. Another world is possible. We're all on different timing, but it's all right. We're all in spirit together. We are unstoppable.
Another world is possible.
We are unstoppable.
Another world is possible.
We are unstoppable.
Another world is possible.
Woo! Thank you, everyone. I so appreciate sharing this hour with you. Thank you again to the incredible panelists who shared their wisdom with us, and Belu for her music, which is another form of wisdom. Thank you all. One last round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.